"One day I will be your wife," the little girl declared to the Earl. He laughed, but he never expected she would actually return. You will witness a story that spans decades, woven with threads of hope, longing, and a promise made by childish lips that defied fate itself. This is a narrative about how true love is not found by chance, but is built day after day, in silent gestures, in cultivated patience, in waits that seem eternal, until finally they bloom like roses in spring. Are you ready to meet Rosalind and Sebastian? An 8-year-old girl who made an impossible promise, and an earl tormented by grief who learned to live again. This is the story of how a broken heart can be mended, not by erasing the past, but by allowing a new love to grow beside it. Where are you watching us from right now? Are you somewhere quiet where you can feel every word? Or are you seeking refuge from the pressures of the day? Before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel and leave your like. Every gesture of support allows more stories like this to reach hearts that need to believe promises can come true. England, Spring 1823, Ravenscroft Manor, County of Yorkshire. The previous night's rain had left the air with that smell of wet earth and perfumed petals that only an English spring could create. Drops still hung from the foliage like tiny diamonds when the Ashfords' carriage stopped at the wrought-iron gates of Ravenscroft Manor. Inside the vehicle, Rosalind Ashford pressed her nose against the fogged glass. Her 8 years of life had never witnessed anything as grand as that grey stone mansion, with its towers rising against the still cloudy sky. Golden hair escaped from the blue ribbon her mother had tied so carefully in Kent that morning, which seemed to belong to another world. "Rosalind, sit properly," murmured Lady Constance Ashford, adjusting her own travelling skirts. "We are only asking for directions. We will not be getting out." But when the coachman opened the door, something inexplicable pulled the girl out. Her feet touched the damp gravel before anyone could stop her. Perhaps it was the roses. Oh, the roses! White and pink climbers scaled the stone walls, wild and tamed at the same time, exuding a perfume that seemed to call only to her. Rosalind ran. Her muslin skirt swayed as she passed through the half-open gate and entered the side gardens. Behind her, she heard her mother's exasperated voice and her father's hurried footsteps, but none of it mattered. Only the flowers mattered, the hundreds of roses that seemed to whisper ancient secrets to the wind. It was there, among the perfectly tended flower beds and the time-stained marble statues, that she saw him. Lord Sebastian Ravenscroft, 5th Earl of Blackwood, stood near a particularly exuberant rosebush, his gloved hands holding a pair of pruning shears. At 31, he possessed that austere beauty of men who carry too much loneliness on their shoulders. Dark hair fell slightly dishevelled over his forehead, and his grey eyes, the colour of storm clouds, rose in surprise upon seeing the little intruder. "Good day," said Rosalind, making an imperfect curtsy she had recently learned. "Your roses are the most beautiful I have ever seen." Sebastian blinked. He was not accustomed to visitors, much less to talkative children materializing in his gardens like springtime apparitions. "Are they?" He lowered the shears. "And how many roses have you seen in your brief existence?" "Not as many as I would like," she replied with absolute seriousness, "but I know beauty when I see it." There was something in that answer, in that innocent conviction that made Sebastian smile. A small, almost forgotten smile, like a memory of who he had been before life began to weigh him down. "You are a connoisseur, then. I am Rosalind Ashford," she announced, as if that name should mean something. "And when I grow up, your lordship will court me, and we shall marry." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Sebastian stared at this child with golden hair and bright blue eyes like a summer sky, so certain of her impossible future. He should have laughed. He should have called her parents and dispatched the family with polite courtesy. But something in that naive declaration, in that promise made with the seriousness of one swearing on the scriptures, touched a part of him he thought dead. Slowly Sebastian knelt on the damp gravel. They were at the same height, eye to eye. "If a lady makes such a promise," he said, his voice low but firm, "she must be prepared to honor it." Rosalind did not waver. She extended her small hand, and Sebastian took it in his larger black-gloved one. "I will be prepared, my lord." At that moment, as Sir Alistair and Lady Constance finally reached their fugitive daughter, red with embarrassment and offering effusive apologies, Sebastian felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity about the future. He released the girl's hand, rose, and greeted the Ashfords with due courtesy. He gave them directions to London, offered them rest and tea, an offer politely refused, and then he watched them leave, little Rosalind waving vigorously from the carriage window until the bend in the road swallowed her from view. Sebastian stood in the gardens for a long time after. The scent of the roses seemed sweeter, the world slightly less grey. That night, before sleeping, he caught himself smiling alone. What an extraordinary creature! What an absurd and charming promise! He never imagined she would keep it. The spring of 1824 arrived at Ravenscroft Manor, bringing more than just flowers. It brought Lady Vivian Fairfax, with auburn hair that caught the light like polished copper, and fingers that danced over the pianoforte keys with supernatural grace. Sebastian met her at a soirée in London, and for the first time since the strange visit from the blue-eyed girl, allowed himself to think about futures. Vivienne laughed easily, played Chopin with devotion, and saw kindness where others saw only duty. They married in May, when the same roses Rosalind had admired were in full bloom. 3 years followed like a serene dream. Vivienne brought music to the silent halls. She played at dusk while Sebastian read, their worlds separate but harmoniously intertwined. They were happy in the quiet, true way that few people achieve, not with tempestuous passion, but with deep respect and genuine affection. Then came the winter of 1827. Snow covered the gardens when Vivienne announced, with tears of joy in her eyes, that she was carrying a child. Sebastian felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't thought possible. He transformed the East Wing into a nursery. He sent for the finest cradle in London, furniture in hand-carved cherrywood, linen curtains from Ireland. August arrived hot and oppressive. The roses had already withered when the pains began. 20 hours of labor, 20 hours of Sebastian pacing the corridors, hands clenching and unclenching, powerless. When the doctor finally emerged, his face said everything before the words could. A girl, born silent, never drew breath. Vivienne, exhausted and bleeding, whispered only once, "May I hold her?" They placed the tiny body in her arms. She kissed the cold forehead, murmured, "Forgive me," and then closed her eyes. The fever came quickly. It burned through her like fire-consuming velvet. In 4 days, Vivienne was also gone, delirious and calling for Sebastian until her last breath. He did not cry when they buried her in the estate cemetery, next to the daughter who never knew the sunlight. He stood under the fine August rain in black from head to toe, looking at the fresh earth without feeling anything. The emptiness was so complete it felt physical, a black hole in the center of his chest. That night, Sebastian ordered the East Wing locked. The keys were put away in a drawer he never opened again. The empty cradle, the broadwood pianoforte Vivienne had loved so much, the dresses still hanging in the wardrobe, everything remained exactly as it was, preserved in an amber of sorrow. The years bled together after that. 1828, 1829, 1830. Sebastian became a ghost in his own home. He managed the estates with mechanical efficiency, fulfilled his duties in the House of Lords, received visitors when absolutely necessary. But he lived in the West Wing chambers, walked the same corridors every day, ate alone in the dining room that could seat 20. Every Sunday, without fail, he visited the graves. He brought white roses, always white like the ones Rosalind had touched that distant day. He would kneel on the grass and tell Vivienne about his week, as if she could still hear him. He asked for forgiveness for not being able to save them. The servants walked in silence. Ravenscroft Manor, once vibrant, had become a mausoleum, and Sebastian slowly began to forget how to live. While Ravenscroft Manor sank into mourning, Ashford Manor in Kent breathed life and learning. Rosalind grew like a resilient tree, graceful but with deep roots. At 10, when Miss Harriet Weatherby arrived as governess, the girl already displayed an unusual seriousness. She wasn't sad, she was contemplative, as if guarding precious secrets in her heart. French, Italian, Greek, Miss Weatherby enumerated, establishing the curriculum. Music, watercolor, dance, embroidery, literature, of course, and household management when appropriate. Rosalind absorbed everything with a quiet hunger. Her fingers learned to dance on the harp strings, to create watercolors of landscapes bathed in golden light, to embroider initials on linen with tiny stitches. But it was in books that she lost herself most. She devoured novels, but also treatises on agriculture, economics, philosophy. Miss Weatherby often found her in the library at dawn, still in her nightgown, reading by the light of nearly consumed candles. "Are you searching for something?" the governess asked once. "Knowledge," Rosalind answered simply, "for when the time comes." There was also the box. It was made of cherrywood, small enough to fit under the bed with a bronze lock. Inside, Rosalind kept letters, dozens of them, written in her best script, addressed to the Right Honourable Lord Sebastian Ravenscroft, Earl of Blackwood. She never sent them. How could she? What child writes to an adult earl? But the words needed to come out, so they filled the paper. They told of her lessons, of the birds she watched from her window, of the books she read and the questions she had about the world. Over time, the letters matured with her, reflecting deeper thoughts, philosophical questions, dreams of a future that seemed simultaneously certain and impossible. When Rosalind turned 16, the world decided she was ready to be courted. First came Percival Waverley, a duke's son, all white smiles and empty confidence. He spoke much about himself and little about anything that mattered. Rosalind politely refused. Next, Viscount Ashworth, 42, a widower, 5 children. A good man, certainly, but his eyes were dead as the windows of an abandoned house. "He seeks a mother, not a wife," Rosalind told her parents. She refused again. Others came. An ennobled merchant named Mr. Thornfield, who smelled of ambition and cigar smoke. A decorated colonel, all military rigidity and expectations of female obedience. Even a Scottish poet who recited overly long verses about landscapes he had never visited. Rosalind refused them all. "Why are you so difficult?" sighed Lady Constance, exasperated. "Are they not all respectable men?" "They are," Rosalind agreed. "But they are not him." She never explained who he was. Her parents thought she referred to some romantic ideal from the novels she devoured. They didn't know about the promise made in a rose garden 13 years ago, but Rosalind remembered every detail. The exact color of Sebastian's stormy eyes, the sound of his voice saying she must be prepared to honor it, the touch of his gloved hand holding hers. In 1836, at 21, Rosalind was presented to Queen Adelaide in a dazzling ceremony where she wore white and pearls and smiled politely at dozens of nobles. She was declared one of the most refined debutantes of the season, and she planned her journey back to Yorkshire. Secretly, she had collected newspaper clippings about Sebastian over the years. Earl of Blackwood absent from Parliament opening. Lord Ravenscroft donates funds to local orphanage. Ravenscroft estates under exemplary management. Between the lines, she read what wasn't written. A man hidden from the world, a heart in hibernation. The night before announcing her decision, Rosalind visited the Ashford family chapel. She knelt and prayed, not for success or romance, but for the courage to honor the childhood promise that had shaped her entire life. When she rose, she was decided. It was time to return to the rose garden. July 1836 dawned clear and hot when Rosalind announced during breakfast that she would travel to Yorkshire. The silence that fell over the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Yorkshire," repeated Sir Alistair, lowering his newspaper. "Whatever for, child?" Rosalind kept her eyes steady. She had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times. To fulfill a promise. Lady Constance closed her eyes briefly. She knew. Somehow she had always known that that strange day at Ravenscroft, so many years ago, was not merely a comical childhood memory. But what could a mother say? That promises from 8-year-old children weren't sacred contracts. Except that, looking at her daughter, this young woman with determined eyes and a straight back, Constance realized arguing would be useless. "You will take Mrs. Caldwell as your companion," she said finally, referring to the respectable widow who occasionally served the family. "You will not travel alone." "Yes, mother." "And if—" Sir Alistair hesitated. "If the Earl does not, if the circumstances are different, then I will return home," Rosalind said softly. "But I must know. I must honor my word." The journey lasted 3 days. The carriage rattled over dirt and stone roads, through forests where light filtered green through the leaves, passing villages with names Rosalind had never heard. Mrs. Caldwell snored delicately on the opposite bench, but Rosalind couldn't sleep. With every mile that brought them closer to Yorkshire, her heart beat faster. What if he didn't remember? What if he refused her? What if, and this was the deepest fear, he was completely different from the man she had built in her imagination? On the second night, they stopped at a modest inn. Rosalind barely touched her dinner of stew and bread. Lying in the narrow bed, listening to Mrs. Caldwell snore in the adjacent room, she opened the cherrywood box she had insisted on bringing. The letters were there, tied with blue ribbon. 13 years of one-sided thoughts. She took the most recent one, written just a week before. "My dearest Lord Ravenscroft, I will soon stand before your lordship again. I will be changed, no longer a child but a woman. Your lordship will have changed too, I suppose. Time transforms everyone. But I hope something remains. I hope the roses still bloom. I hope there is space in your heart and life for possibilities. I come not as a hunter of fortune or title. I come because a promise was made and promises matter. Because I saw something in your eyes that day. Kindness, perhaps. Loneliness, certainly. And because I believe, stubbornly, madly, that some promises are destiny. With unwavering respect, Rosalind." She put the letter away again. She wouldn't send it. None of them would be sent. They were just anchors. reminders to herself that this path had been chosen consciously step by step year after year. On the third day they spotted the village of Blackwood. It was smaller than Rosalind remembered, a cluster of stone cottages, a church with a square tower, an inn called the Crown and Anchor. Ordinary people did ordinary things, carried baskets, led horses, talked in small groups. "We will stop here," Rosalind decided. "I will not simply appear unannounced." Mrs. Caldwell seemed relieved. They settled into the inn, two simple but clean rooms. The innkeeper, a portly man with red cheeks named Mr. Griggs, was effusive in his welcome. "We don't get many ladies in these parts," he exclaimed. "Visiting family, are you?" "Something like that," Rosalind murmured. That afternoon, she walked alone to the church. It was grey stone, ancient with modest stained-glass windows that cast coloured light on the worn pews. No one was there except the thick silence that all holy places possess. Rosalind knelt and prayed. She didn't know exactly for what. Courage, perhaps, wisdom, or simply that, whatever the outcome, she would face it with dignity. When she left, the sun was setting. On the horizon, rising against the orange sky like a stone sentinel, she saw Ravenscroft Manor. Her heart tightened. Tomorrow she would know if an 8-year-old girl had sealed her own destiny, or if promises were just words carried on the wind. The morning arrived heavy with mist. Rosalind, dressed in her best travelling suit, emerald green silk with black details, a modest hat, white gloves. Mrs. Caldwell arranged her hair in an elegant but not ostentatious coiffure. In the mirror, Rosalind saw no longer the girl with dishevelled hair, but a woman. Pretty, perhaps. Determined? Certainly. "There is still time to turn back," Mrs. Caldwell offered softly. "There never was," Rosalind replied. The rented carriage climbed the avenue of oaks that led to Ravenscroft Manor. Rosalind kept her hands clasped firmly in her lap to stop them from trembling. The mansion revealed itself gradually. First the towers, then the immense stone wings, finally the gardens. The roses were still there. Wilder now, less meticulously pruned, but exuberant and fragrant. Something in Rosalind's throat tightened. An elderly butler in black livery opened the door before she could knock. He had kind but cautious eyes. Blackwell, she would later learn. "Good day, miss," he said, assessing her with an experienced gaze. "May I help you?" "I request an audience with Lord Ravenscroft," Rosalind said, lifting her chin. "Lady Rosalind Ashford of Kent." If Blackwell recognized the name, he didn't show it. "Please wait here." The entrance hall was grand and somber. Ancient tapestries hung on the walls. Portraits of ancestors looked on with severe expressions. Everything seemed preserved in amber, beautiful but dead. Rosalind waited. Each second felt like an hour. Finally, footsteps, heavy, measured, and then he appeared at the top of the marble staircase. Sebastian. 13 years had etched lines on his face. Around his eyes, a few silver threads in his dark temples. But his eyes were the same, grey as a contained storm. He descended the steps with the erect posture of one born to command, but there was something indefinably tired in his movements. He stopped a few paces from her. He frowned slightly. "Lady Ashford," he greeted, courteous but distant. "Blackwell mentioned you requested an audience." "Do we know each other?" Rosalind's heart sank and soared simultaneously. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. She was a child. Now she was— "Yes, my lord," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We do know each other. Many years ago. In these very gardens." Sebastian studied her. There was something vaguely familiar in the blue eyes, but— "Forgive me, I don't recall—" "I was a child," Rosalind continued. "I was 8 years old. My family stopped here asking for directions. I fled into your rose gardens and made a promise." The silence fell like a stone in a deep well. Sebastian stood completely still. His eyes widened slowly, the memory returning like a tide. The girl from the garden, the golden hair, the absurd seriousness, the impossible promise. "No," he whispered. "It cannot be. I am the girl who promised to marry your lordship," Rosalind said calmly. "And I have come to honor my word." The world tilted. Sebastian gripped the staircase banister. His mind reeled. This was madness. The girl? She grew up. She transformed into this woman before him, elegant and serious, looking at him with those same eyes that 13 years ago shone with childish certainty. He tried to speak. The words failed him. "I understand if your lordship finds this irregular," Rosalind continued, her hands still clasped tightly to keep them steady. "I expect nothing. But you said that if a lady makes such a promise, she must be prepared to honor it." "Very well." She took a deep breath. "Here I am, prepared." Sebastian ran a hand over his face. He needed to sit. He needed to think. But above all, he needed to understand if he was dreaming, or if reality had become as strange as his dreams. "Your ladyship honors me by remembering that day," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "But surely you understand that was a childish fantasy, not a real promise. To me, it was always real." The simplicity of that statement cut deeper than any elaborate argument. Sebastian looked at her, really looked. He saw determination, yes, but also vulnerability, courage that had cost something. This woman had crossed England because of words exchanged in a garden over a decade ago. It was madness. It was also extraordinary. "Did your ladyship travel alone?" he asked, finally remembering propriety. "With my companion, Mrs. Caldwell. We are at the village inn." "Absolutely not," Sebastian said automatically. Hospitality was a duty, even in bizarre circumstances. "You will stay here. Blackwell, prepare chambers in the west wing for Lady Ashford and her companion." "My lord," Rosalind protested. "I don't need— I insist." He raised a hand. "You came this far. The least I can offer is roof and food while we discuss this unusual situation." Rosalind inclined her head in thanks. As Blackwell left to give orders, Sebastian and Rosalind stood in the hall. The grandfather clock ticked off the seconds. Outside, birds sang. Inside, two worlds, past and present, fantasy and reality, had just collided, and neither of them knew exactly what to do next. The first few days were a careful dance of courtesy and awkwardness. Rosalind settled into the West Wing chambers, spacious rooms overlooking the rose gardens, dark mahogany furniture, moss-green velvet curtains. Mrs. Caldwell occupied the adjoining room and assumed the role of vigilant guardian of her charge's reputation. Meals were formal events. Sebastian sat at one end of the immense dining table, Rosalind at the other, with Mrs. Caldwell appropriately present as chaperone. They spoke on safe topics, the weather, politics, books. Sebastian discovered, to his surprise, that Rosalind was deeply read. She knew Wordsworth and Byron, discussed Adam Smith's moral philosophy with unusual fluency, and had even read agricultural treatises. "How does a young lady become interested in crop rotation?" he asked one night, genuinely curious. "How does an earl not?" she countered. "It is the foundation of your land's prosperity." He had no answer for that. Between meals, Rosalind explored. Ravenscroft Manor was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each preserved in different eras. She found the library on the third day, a two-story room with oak shelves rising to the painted ceiling, thousands of leather-bound volumes exuding that delicious smell of old paper and accumulated wisdom. "May I?" she asked Sebastian, finding him there one afternoon. "Of course," he said, surprised. "I don't often have interested visitors." Rosalind ran her fingers along the spines. History, philosophy, poetry, science. It was a treasure trove. "Someone who collected all this loved knowledge," she observed. "My grandfather," Sebastian replied. "And my father. And I at one point." At one point. As if love for knowledge for the world was a thing of the past. Rosalind noted it but didn't comment. It was on the fifth day that she found the music room. It was in the east wing, the part of the house Sebastian never visited, which the servants cleaned with the reverence of maintaining a tomb. Rosalind didn't know this when she opened the double mahogany doors. The room took her breath away. A broadwood pianoforte dominated the center, covered by a dusty white sheet. There was a harp in the corner, sheet music stacked on a music stand, silver candelabras that hadn't seen a flame in years. Everything perfectly preserved, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment. Rosalind approached the pianoforte. Her hands removed the sheet carefully, revealing polished ebony wood, ivory keys slightly yellowed by time but flawless. She sat down. She played a note. The sound echoed through the empty room, clear and true. The instrument was perfectly tuned. Someone cared for it, even if it was never played. Her fingers found a Mozart sonata, delicate, melancholic, fitting for silent halls and closed hearts. The notes flowed, filling the emptiness with something that wasn't exactly joy, but perhaps was hope. She didn't hear the door open, didn't see Sebastian standing in the entryway, frozen. For him it was as if time had regressed. Vivian sitting right there, playing exactly that way. For a hallucinatory moment, he thought ghosts were real, that the dead could return. Then Rosalind turned and the illusion shattered. It wasn't Vivienne. It was this other woman, this stranger who had invaded his life with impossible promises. "Forgive me," Rosalind said quickly, standing up. "I shouldn't have. I didn't know it was private." "It's not private," Sebastian said, his voice strangely hoarse. "Just forgotten." He entered the room. Each step cost him something. He hadn't set foot in there since... "Someone cares for this instrument," Rosalind observed. "It's tuned, loved. It was. Sebastian touched the top of the pianoforte. My wife played. Every day. She was talented. The first time he had mentioned Vivian. Was? Rosalind caught the past tense. She died. The words came out dry as sun-bleached bone. 9 years ago. In childbirth. The child as well. Oh. Understanding flooded Rosalind like a wave. The silent house. The locked rooms. The loneliness that emanated from Sebastian like a fog. Grief. Grief so deep it had frozen time. I'm so sorry, she said softly. Yes, he stepped back. Everyone is. But being sorry didn't bring anyone back. Being sorry didn't fill the void. Sorry was an empty word. Rosalind watched him leave, his shoulders bowed under an invisible weight. Something in her decided in that moment. She couldn't undo Sebastian's past, but maybe she could help him live in the present. That night, at dinner, she asked about the estates. Not superficially, genuinely. How many tenants, what crops, what were the yields? Sebastian, surprised, answered. The conversation flowed. Rosalind asked intelligent questions, offered observations based on her readings. Your ladyship reads more than I imagined, he admitted. I prepared myself, she said simply. For what? She met his gaze across the flickering candles. To be worthy of the promise I made. Sebastian didn't know what to reply. This baffling woman, with her direct answers and eyes that saw too much. He was beginning to understand that Rosalind Ashford was not some foolish romantic fantasy. She was something far more complex, and infinitely more dangerous to a heart that had sworn never to feel again. August brought unusual heat to Yorkshire. The air grew thick, almost tangible, charged with the electricity that precedes a storm. Rosalind, now completing 3 weeks at Ravenscroft, felt the change not only in the weather, but in something more subtle, the dynamic of the house. Sebastian's gazes becoming less guarded, the conversations extending beyond necessity. But there were doors that remained closed, literally. The East Wing had intrigued her since she played the pianoforte. Mrs. Thornhill, the grey-haired, kind-faced housekeeper, had mentioned casually during a conversation about the garden. It's where Lady Vivian lived, poor soul. Lord Ravenscroft never went back in after she... Well, the doors had been locked for 9 years. Rosalind couldn't stop thinking about it. A man imprisoning himself in grief, preserving the past like an insect in amber. Vivienne deserved to be remembered, certainly, but did she also deserve to be a tomb that trapped the living? On one particularly stuffy afternoon, while Sebastian was dealing with estate matters and Mrs. Caldwell was napping, Rosalind did what she should not have. She found the keys. Blackwell, in a moment of distraction, had left the ring on a hall table. Rosalind took it, heart pounding, conscience screaming. But curiosity, or perhaps necessity, was stronger. The East Wing smelled of stop time, furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts, portraits on the walls showing a woman with auburn hair and a serene smile. Vivian, beautiful in a soft, almost ethereal way. Rosalind walked through salons and bedrooms. Everything was perfectly preserved. Dresses still hung in cedar wardrobes, silver brushes on a vanity, music books open to the page Vivienne had last played. And then she saw the cradle. In the back room, bathed in the golden afternoon light, was the most beautiful cradle she had ever seen. Cherrywood carved with roses and vines, a white lace canopy, a tiny quilt embroidered with initials that were never used. Empty, preserved for a child who never drew breath. Rosalind's throat tightened. This was more than grief. It was a shrine. It was Sebastian keeping ghosts alive, because letting them go felt like betrayal. What are you doing here? Sebastian's voice cut like a whip. Rosalind spun around. He was in the doorway, his face pale with shock and fury. The words failed. Get out! It wasn't a request. It was an order. Get out now. Lord Ravenscroft. Who gave you the right? His voice broke. Who gave you permission to enter where you do not belong? Rosalind held her ground, though she was trembling. No one. I acted on my own. Then you should have better sense. Should I? Something inside her ignited. Or should your lordship have the courage to live? Stunned silence. Sebastian stared at her as if she had committed sacrilege. How dare you? How dare I? Rosalind took a step forward. Your lordship has built a mausoleum. You have imprisoned yourself in a past that will never return. Vivian deserves to be remembered, yes. But does she deserve to be a prison? Does she deserve for your lordship to bury yourself along with her? You don't understand anything. I understand grief. The words came out harshly. I understand loss. But I also know that the living must live. And what do you know about losing everything? Sebastian was shaking now. Did you hold someone as life slipped away? Did you bury a wife and child in the same week? No, Rosalind admitted, her eyes burning. But I know what it is to love someone who cannot, or will not love you back. And I know that I am here, alive, real, trying to build a future, while your lordship clings to tombs." The raw truth between them vibrated like a violin string. Sebastian took a step back. His fury collapsed into something more dangerous, pure pain. "Leave this wing," he said, his voice dead. "Now." "No, leave." "No!" Rosalind planted her feet. "Not until you hear this. Keeping these doors locked doesn't bring anyone back. Preserving rooms doesn't undo tragedy. Your lordship has a right to grief, but you do not have the right to waste the life you have left." "I have nothing left." "So you have me." The shout echoed through the empty wing. Both of them froze. Rosalind covered her mouth, horrified at her own audacity, but she did not take the words back. Sebastian looked at her, really looked. He saw not the girl from the garden, not the inconvenient intruder. He saw a woman who had crossed England for an impossible promise, who had learned, grown, prepared herself, who stood there firm, demanding that he live when living seemed impossible. Something inside him cracked. "Why did you come?" he whispered. "Truly, why did you come?" Rosalind lowered her hand. Her blue eyes, always so controlled, glistened with moisture. "Because an 8-year-old child looked at a man in the gardens and saw kindness. She saw someone who knelt to speak at her level, who took an absurd promise seriously. And that child grew up loving the idea of that man." She took a shaky breath. "And as a woman I discovered that your lordship existed, lived, bled. I came because I want to know the real man, not the earl, not the widower, Sebastian. No one had called him that in years." He closed his eyes. Tears, the first in 9 years, burned behind his eyelids. "I don't know if I can," he confessed. "I don't know if there's anything left but this." He gestured to the dead wing. "Then find out," Rosalind said softly. "With me." When he opened his eyes, she was there, real, waiting, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Sebastian considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the dead would want the living to keep on living. September arrived with rains that washed away the August heat and brought with it an unexpected visitor. The Dowager Countess Ravenscroft descended from her imposing carriage on a grey afternoon, leaning on an ebony cane with a silver handle. At 62, she was still formidable, straight back, penetrating eyes of the same stormy grey as her son's, white hair coiffed impeccably under a feathered hat. "Mother," Sebastian said, genuinely surprised, kissing her gloved hand. "We weren't expecting—" "Evidently," she retorted, "or you would have warned me about your guest." So the rumours had reached her in Bath. Dinner was a tense event. The Dowager Countess sat at the head of the table, a position that had been hers when her husband lived, and studied Rosalind with an intensity that would have melted weaker women. "So," she said, delicately cutting her pheasant, "the girl from the garden. My son told me that story years ago. I found it charming, childish but charming." "Your Grace is very kind," Rosalind replied politely. "I am not kind. I am direct." The Countess set down her silverware. "You travelled here alone?" "With my companion, to claim a promise made by an 8-year-old child." It wasn't a question. Rosalind maintained her composure. "To honour a promise made by an 8-year-old child," she corrected. "There is a difference." A tiny smile touched the Countess's lips. "Honour, an interesting choice of word." She picked up her wineglass. "And what do you hope to gain from this?" "Nothing that is not freely offered. Diplomatic answers. You learned well from your governess." "I learned truth from my conscience," Rosalind said calmly. "Miss Weatherby merely taught me to articulate it politely." The Countess set her glass down abruptly. Sebastian tensed, expecting an explosion. Instead, his mother laughed. A genuine, rich laugh that filled the dining room. "I like you, girl," she declared. "How you have spirit. More importantly, you have substance." She turned to Sebastian. "Have you been talking to her?" "Yes, mother. Really talking." "Or just empty pleasantries?" Sebastian hesitated. "Mother, this is ridiculous. Unusual, perfectly scandalous." The Countess waved impatiently. "Yes to all. It is also the only spark of life I've seen in this house in 9 years." A heavy silence fell. "Sebastian," the Countess said, her tone softer now, "I lost your father. I know what grief is. But I also know he never would have wanted me to stop living. Vivian," she looked directly at her son, "was too good to wish this dead existence upon you." Sebastian gripped the napkin in his lap hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "How can you know what Vivian would have wanted?" "Because we talked. Because she told me, shortly before she died, that her greatest fear was not death. It was leaving you alone." Tears burned Sebastian's eyes. The Countess rose, approached her son, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Grief honors the dead, my son, but life honors their memories. This young woman," she gestured to Rosalind, "has come to offer you life. The question is, are you brave enough to accept it? That night, long after everyone had retired, Sebastian walked to the gardens. The moon was waxing, bathing the roses in silver light. He sat on the same bench where 13 years ago he had spoken with a bright-eyed girl. He heard footsteps on the gravel. Rosalind, wrapped in a woolen shawl, approached hesitantly. "May I?" He nodded. She sat, maintaining a respectful distance. They sat in silence for a long time. The scent of the late roses mixed with the night dampness. "My mother is right," he said at last. "As always, about everything." He turned to face her. "Rosalind, I don't know if I can be what you expect. I have been broken for so long." "I don't expect perfection," she said softly. "I expect honesty. I expect an attempt, and if I fail, then we will have failed together." She took his hand, the first real contact between them. "But Sebastian, what if we don't?" He looked at their intertwined hands, hers small and warm, his larger and trembling slightly. "I need to know," he said. "Is this pity? Did you come out of pity?" "No," Rosalind answered firmly. "I came because a promise deserved to be honored, because I believed we could build something true. And I came," her voice grew softer, "because my heart chose you a long time ago, and stubborn hearts rarely change their minds." Sebastian took a shaky breath. "Rosalind Ashford," he said, formal but with a thick voice, "would you do me the honor of marrying me?" The world stopped. She had waited for this for 13 years. Dreamed, planned, prepared. But to hear the real words here now from lips that were finally trying to live again. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Sebastian, yes." He pulled her gently, and their lips met in a chaste but deeply meaningful kiss. Though it wasn't fiery passion, it was a promise. It was a beginning. It was two ghosts learning to be human again. The wedding preparations filled Ravenscroft Manor with a life it hadn't known in years. Seamstresses came from York, florists from Leeds. Servants swept and polished every inch until the stone shone. The Dowager Countess supervised everything with military efficiency, declaring that if her son had finally decided to live, he would do it in style. The public engagement announcement caused waves. Lady Rosalind Ashford, refined debutante from Kent, marrying the reclusive Earl of Blackwood. What a romance! What a scandal! Speculation filled tea rooms from London to Edinburgh. It was during the pre-nuptial party in October that the storm arrived. Duke Octavius de Grenville arrived uninvited, a distant cousin of Sebastian's, a man of 39 who looked like he had lived many of those years poorly. He had small, hungry eyes and a carefully trimmed mustache that didn't hide the cruelty of his thin lips. Rosalind was speaking with some guests when he approached, a glass of champagne in hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lady Rosalind," he said too loudly, causing nearby conversations to cease. "Or should I say future Countess?" "Savuc de Grenville," she greeted politely, though something about him made her want to retreat. "A remarkable trajectory," he continued, circling her like a predator, from a baronet's daughter to a countess. "You must be very proud of yourself." Sebastian, crossing the room, stopped, something in Grenville's tone. "I beg your pardon," Rosalind said, keeping her voice neutral. "Oh, I don't feign morality." Grenville drank deeply. "I admire it, in fact. Female ambition is so that's refreshing, telling a charming story about a childhood promise, appealing to a rich cousin's lonely heart." "Watch your words," Sebastian warned, approaching. Grenville ignored him, eyes fixed on Rosalind. "How long did you plan this?" "Years, I imagine. Researching, preparing." "Oh, it's brilliant." "It truly is. So I bet you even read books on agriculture to impress him, didn't you?" "Such dedication." Murmurs filled the hall. Some guests looked shocked, others curious. Everyone watched Rosalind. She could have cried. She could have fled. She could have asked Sebastian to defend her. She did none of those things. Instead, she walked to where her reticule lay, retrieved a small object, and returned. It was the cherrywood box, the box with the letters. "Your Grace accuses me of being a fortune hunter," she said, her voice clear and firm, "of staging this. Allow me to show you the performance." She opened the box. Dozens of letters tied in blue ribbon spilled slightly. "These," she said, picking one at random, "are letters I wrote to Lord Ravenscroft over 13 years. They were never sent. They were just records of thoughts, feelings, growth." She unrolled one. Her voice trembled only slightly as she read, "My dearest Lord Ravenscroft, I am 14 today. Miss Weatherby says I am growing up well. I'm learning French and music, but I often wonder if your lordship still visits the rose gardens. I wonder if you still remember the foolish girl who made an impossible promise. I hope so, because I have never forgotten." Absolute silence. She picked up another, more recent. I have come to learn from the papers that your lordship has suffered a great loss. My heart aches for your pain. I wish I could lighten your burden, but I know some sorrows must be carried alone. Still, I promise this. If fate ever brings us together, I will try to bring light where there is darkness. Rosalind looked up at Grenville. Is this a performance, Your Grace? 13 years of unshared thoughts, or is it simply a girl foolish enough to believe promises matter? Grenville turned pale. Anyone can write dates, the Dowager Countess interrupted, taking a letter and examining it. Each letter is dated, faded ink on the old ones, fresh on the recent, and handwriting that evolves from childish to mature. She stared down Grenville. Are you suggesting she forged years of private correspondence she never expected to show anyone? Sebastian took a letter, then another. He read fragments of years of Rosalind's life, thoughts she had kept like treasures, dreams she had cultivated in silence. Something in his chest tightened painfully. Grenville, he said, his voice dangerously low, you have 60 seconds to leave my house before I have you removed personally. Sebastian, 55. The Duke looked around. There were no allies there, only disapproving faces, silent censure. He left hurriedly, his dignity in tatters. When the door slammed shut, the Dowager Countess began to applaud. Slowly others joined in, until the hall resonated with approval. Rosalind, trembling now that the adrenaline was fading, felt herself being held. Sebastian was there, his arms around her. You didn't have to defend yourself, he murmured. I did, she replied. For me, for us. He held her face gently. You are extraordinary. That night in the silence of her room, Rosalind cried, not from sadness but from relief. She had faced her greatest fear, being seen as an impostor, and survived. And Sebastian, rereading the letters until dawn, finally understood. It was not he doing her a favor by accepting her. It was she offering a gift he didn't deserve but desperately needed. The chance to love again. December arrived covered in snow. Ice crystals decorated the windows of Ravenscroft Manor, and the world seemed suspended in reverent silence, as if even nature recognized the solemnity of what was to come. York Minster rose majestically against the winter sky, Gothic stone reaching for the heavens, medieval stained glass casting colored light down the central aisle. 500 guests filled the pews, a manifestation of the union's importance. Nobles from all over England, court representatives, ancient families with lineages stretching back centuries. But for Rosalind, waiting in the antechamber in a white silk gown covered in Brussels lace, every stitch hand-sewn over months, there was only one man who mattered. Still time to run, her father, Sir Alistair, joked, nervously adjusting his cravat. His own eyes shone with moisture. I've waited 13 years, Rosalind replied, adjusting her veil. I'm not running now. Lady Constance kissed her daughter's forehead. You always knew, didn't you? Ever since that day. Always, Rosalind confirmed. The organ began to play. Doors opened. The aisle seemed eternal. Rosalind walked on her father's arm, each step measured, each breath conscious. The guests were a blur of faces. There was only the altar, the flickering candles, and Sebastian. He was in full dress uniform, an embroidered coat, medals inherited from his father, a ceremonial sword at his side. But what Rosalind saw was the man behind the regalia, the man who had learned to risk again. When their eyes met, she saw unshed tears there. Sir Alistair placed Rosalind's hand in Sebastian's. The grip was firm, a mutual anchor. The Bishop of York, in full vestments, began the ceremony with a voice that echoed in the high vaults. We are gathered here in the sight of God. The words washed over them. Rosalind heard but didn't process. She was lost in Sebastian's grey eyes, seeing a reflection of herself there. No longer the girl from the garden, but a woman who had chosen this path consciously. Sebastian Edmund Ravenscroft, intoned the bishop, do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? I do, Sebastian said, his voice clear and firm. Rosalind Catherine Ashford, do you take this man to be your lawful wedded husband? I do, she replied, smiling through tears that finally fell. The rings were exchanged, simple gold engraved with the date, symbols of eternity that weighed less than feathers, but carried the weight of promises. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the bishop declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Sebastian drew her in gently. The kiss was chaste, appropriate for a cathedral and 500 onlookers. But there was a promise there, a whisper of future intimacies. The congregation burst into applause. The organ thundered a triumphant recessional march. They were married. The reception at Ravenscroft Manor was splendid. The ballroom, closed for years, had been opened and restored. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light. Tables groaned under the weight of food and flowers. Music filled every corner. The Dowager Countess presented Rosalind with a pearl necklace, an heirloom of the Ravenscroft Countesses, passed down for generations. "It belonged to my husband's mother," she said, fastening the clasp at Rosalind's neck, "and to her mother before. Now it belongs to you. Wear it well." Rosalind touched the pearls, each one perfect, smooth as fossilized tears. "I will honor it. I know you will." Sebastian and Rosalind danced the first waltz as husband and wife. She had always been a good dancer. Miss Weatherby had seen to that. But dancing with Sebastian was different. He led her with surprising confidence, and their bodies found a natural rhythm. "Happy?" he murmured. "More than words can express." "Frightened?" "Terrified," she admitted honestly. He smiled, that rare smile that transformed his face. "Me too." The night gradually emptied. Guests departed. Lights were extinguished. Servants collected forgotten glasses. Eventually only Sebastian and Rosalind remained. They climbed the stairs together. Rosalind was led not to the guest chambers in the West Wing, but to the master apartments, the rooms that had been Sebastian's and, before, Vivienne's, but no longer. Everything had been renewed. New curtains, rearranged furniture, Vivienne's belongings respectfully stored. It was simultaneously the same space and completely different. A new beginning. Sebastian helped Rosalind with her veil, his fingers trembling slightly. There was a decade and a half between them in age, but none in nervousness. "Rosalind," he said when they finally stood in just their robes, "I don't need to. If you're not ready." She placed her fingers on his lips. "I'm ready," she said softly. "I've been ready for 13 years. That night was tender and hesitant. A mutual discovery, a shared vulnerability. It wasn't perfect. First times rarely are, but it was honest, real. And when they finally fell asleep, intertwined as snow fell silently outside, they both felt a peace they hadn't known was possible. A promise made by an 8-year-old child had transformed into sacred vows, and the impossible had become real beauty. The first months of marriage were a delicate dance of two individuals learning to live as a unit. Rosalind would awaken before dawn, sometimes momentarily forgetting where she was, until she felt the weight of Sebastian's arm around her, and reality, sweet and surreal, returned. They were married, truly married. Sebastian, for his part, fought against decades of ingrained solitude. He still woke up expecting emptiness beside him. Finding Rosalind there, golden hair, spread over the pillow, sleeping with a small smile, was a gentle shock he secretly feared would disappear. They established routines. Breakfast together in the morning room, where light streamed softly through linen curtains. Sebastian read correspondence while Rosalind embroidered or read. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply existed beside each other, sharing a comfortable silence. "The tenants on the south property," Rosalind commented one morning, without lifting her eyes from her embroidery, "mentioned during my last visit that the mill needs repair." Sebastian lowered the letter he was reading. "How do you know this?" "I visited them last week, with Mrs. Thornhill." "You visited the tenants?" Rosalind finally looked at him, slightly confused. "Shouldn't I? I am the Countess now." "I thought it was part of the duties." Something in Sebastian softened. Vivienne had never been interested in the estates, not out of cruel disinterest, but simply because her life was music and art. Rosalind, on the other hand, dove into the responsibilities with veracity. "Yes," he said softly, "you should. And you are correct about the mill. I will see to the repairs." She smiled, small but genuine, and returned to her embroidery. In the evenings they read together in the library. Sebastian discovered Rosalind had strong opinions on philosophy, especially Adam Smith and his theories on the market. "But look," she would argue, pointing to a passage, "Smith recognizes that a free market requires a moral framework. Without it, it becomes predatory. And you believe morality can be legislated? Not legislated, cultivated." Her eyes shone with intellectual fervor. "Through education, community, example." These were discussions Sebastian hadn't had in years. Vivienne preferred to talk of music, art, abstract beauty. Rosalind debated economics, politics, land management. It wasn't better or worse. It was different, and Sebastian gradually allowed himself to appreciate this difference without guilt. The physical relationship also deepened. That shy first night gave way to growing intimacy. Sebastian was a careful lover, always attentive to Rosalind's comfort, and she, in turn, revealed a passion that surprised them both. On one particularly cold February night, as they lay intertwined under thick quilts, Rosalind traced the old scars on Sebastian's chest, a mark from a childhood fall from a horse. "You're beautiful," she murmured. He laughed softly. "I'm old. You're 44. That isn't old. I could be your father." But you're not. She kissed his shoulder. You're my husband. August arrived, marking the anniversary of Vivienne's death, a date Sebastian dreaded. But Rosalind didn't try to erase the grief. Instead, on the morning of the anniversary, she accompanied him to the cemetery. It was the first time Sebastian had taken anyone else there. They stood before the twin graves, Vivienne and the baby they never knew. Rosalind held his hand silently. I want you to know, Sebastian said, his voice hoarse, that you do not replace her. I know, Rosalind replied, and I don't wish to. Vivienne was real, she was loved. She deserves her place in your heart. But there is also a place for you. I know that too. He pulled her against him. They cried together. He for Vivienne, she for the man Vivienne had loved and lost. When they left, Sebastian felt something he hadn't expected. Lightness. As if, by finally acknowledging that loving Rosalind didn't betray Vivienne's memory, he allowed himself peace. That night, lying in the dark, he whispered, I love you. Rosalind froze. It was the first time he had said it. She turned to face him. Even in the darkness, she could see the glint of his eyes. Say it again, she asked. I love you, Rosalind, firmer now. Not in the same way I loved Vivienne, but not less, different but true. Tears streamed silently down her face. I love you too, she whispered. I always have. They made love that night with a new urgency. It was no longer a tentative discovery. It was an affirmation, a celebration, a renewed promise. And in April, when Rosalind woke up feeling nauseous for the third morning in a row, and her breasts became painfully tender, she knew. She called for Dr. Whitmore. He confirmed it with a careful examination. Congratulations, Lady Ravenscroft. 4 months, I'd say. The babe will arrive in September. Rosalind sat down slowly. 4 months. She had been pregnant for 4 months and hadn't even realized. Fear flooded her, not for herself but for Sebastian. Vivienne had died in childbirth. The baby too. How could she tell him without making him relive that nightmare? But she had to. There were no secrets between them. That night after dinner, she took his hand. Sebastian, I need to tell you something. He saw the seriousness on her face and paled. What is it? I am. She took a deep breath. Pregnant. The world stopped. Sebastian stared at her. The blood drained from his face. No, he whispered. Sebastian! No! He stood up abruptly. No. Rosalind reached for him, but he recoiled. You don't understand, he said, his voice breaking. Vivienne, the baby. I cannot lose you. You will not lose me. You cannot promise that. She went to him, held his face firmly. I cannot promise, she agreed, but I can fight. And I will fight. For the baby. For us. Sebastian collapsed. He knelt, pressed his face against Rosalind's belly where life was growing and wept. And she held him, whispering promises she hoped she could keep. Rosalind's pregnancy transformed Sebastian into an almost unrecognizable creature. He hired 3 doctors from London, the best obstetricians money could buy. He sent for an experienced midwife, Mrs. Pemberton, who moved into Ravenscroft 4 months before the due date. He completely renovated the East Wing, transforming it from a mausoleum into a children's wing. New cradles, rooms painted in soft yellows, windows that let light flood in. Vivienne's belongings were stored in the attic. Not with anger or rejection, but with reverence. Rosalind insisted on helping, touching the dresses gently before folding them into cedar chests. She would have approved of this, Rosalind said. New life being born where there was so much grief. Sebastian wanted to believe it, but the terror was constant, a faithful companion that followed him every moment. He woke in the middle of the night to check if Rosalind was still breathing. He forbade her from climbing stairs alone. He refused to let her go out in any weather that wasn't perfect. Sebastian, she said patiently one afternoon, when he protested a walk in the gardens, I am pregnant, not dying. Yet, he murmured, immediately regretting it as he saw the hurt in her eyes. But Rosalind understood. Trauma didn't disappear with logic, so she allowed him the overcautiousness, accepted the restrictions with grace, and held his hand when he woke from nightmares, screaming Vivienne's name. The baby grew. Rosalind's belly rounded visibly. In June, she felt the first movements, a delicate flutter like butterfly wings. Sebastian, she called one night, taking his hand and placing it on her belly. Feel, he waited, barely breathing. Then there, a tiny but unmistakable kick. Tears filled his eyes. It's alive, he whispered. It's alive, she confirmed. And strong. August was suffocating. Rosalind, now enormously pregnant, moved with difficulty. Her back ached constantly. Her ankles swelled. Sleeping was almost impossible. But she didn't complain. The Dowager Countess visited frequently, bringing practical advice and stories of her own childbirths. "It hurts like the devil," she said frankly. "Don't let them tell you otherwise. But at the end, when you hold the child, it's worth every second. What if something goes wrong?" Rosalind whispered when Sebastian was out of earshot. The Countess held her hand tightly. "Then we will deal with it. But do not anticipate tragedy. You are young, healthy, strong. Vivienne was delicate, and even she survived the birth. It was the fever after that took her. Sebastian won't survive if he loses me." "Then don't be lost," the Countess said simply. "Fight, because that man needs you." September arrived with late rains. On the night of the 15th, Rosalind felt the first contractions. She woke Sebastian at 3 in the morning. "It's time," she said calmly, though terror snaked through her veins. Sebastian paled so completely that for a moment it looked like he would faint. "Call the doctors," Rosalind said. "And Mrs. Pemberton and Sebastian." She held his face. "Breathe." The next few hours were a blur. Mrs. Pemberton took charge with comforting efficiency. The 3 London doctors circled like well-intentioned vultures. The Dowager Countess arrived at dawn and took up a position by the bed, holding Rosalind's hand. Sebastian was banished from the room. "Unsuitable for men," Mrs. Pemberton declared. He paced the corridors like a ghost, counting every cry that escaped through the heavy doors. Noon, afternoon, twilight. Rosalind fought. God, how she fought. Every contraction was a wave of pain that threatened to drown her. But she thought of Sebastian outside, alone with his terrors, and refused to give up. "I see the head," exclaimed Mrs. Pemberton. "One more push, my lady." Rosalind gathered every remaining fragment of strength and pushed. The cry that filled the room was the most beautiful sound anyone had ever heard. "A boy," announced Mrs. Pemberton, lifting a tiny, red, angry creature. Healthy and strong. Rosalind collapsed against the pillows, laughing and crying simultaneously. The Dowager Countess ran to the door. "Sebastian!" she shouted. "You have a son?" He burst in like a storm. His eyes searched for Rosalind first, alive, conscious, smiling, despite the exhaustion. Then he saw the baby, now cleaned and bundled, being placed in his wife's arms. He approached slowly, as if afraid the scene would disappear. "Rosalind, I'm fine," she promised. Look at our son." The baby had tufts of dark hair like his father's, tiny fists flailing indignantly. Sebastian sat carefully on the edge of the bed. Rosalind placed the baby in his arms. He looked at his son, this impossible miracle, this life that had survived where another had not, and he wept. He wept for Vivienne and the daughter he never knew. He wept with relief that Rosalind was alive. He wept with joy because he held the future in his arms. "Benedict," Rosalind whispered. "Benedict Alistair Ravenscroft, Viscount Ashford," the Dowager Countess added, smiling through her own tears. "Your heir Sebastian." That night, after the doctors had left and the servants had celebrated, and the Dowager Countess had finally retired, Sebastian lay down carefully beside Rosalind. Benedict slept in a bassinet nearby, his breathing soft and regular. "Thank you," Sebastian murmured. "For what? For living, for fighting, for giving me this." Rosalind turned her face to look at him. "You gave me a reason to fight," she said. "A promise made 14 years ago has finally been fulfilled. Not just in a marriage vow, but in this." She gestured to the baby. "A family, a future." Sebastian kissed her forehead, and for the first time in decades, he felt something he thought was lost forever. Pure hope, untainted by the shadows of the past. The first years of Benedict were a transformation. Ravenscroft Manor, so long silent as a tomb, filled with a baby's cries, laughter, the sounds of life being lived completely. Benedict was a beautiful, laughing baby, with his father's dark hair and eyes that gradually lightened to his mother's blue. Sebastian revealed himself to be a devoted father in a way that surprised even himself. He woke for night feedings, hummed tuneless songs to soothe crying, spent hours simply watching his son sleep, marveling that something so perfect existed. Rosalind blossomed in motherhood. She managed the estates with increasing efficiency, established a Sunday school for the children of Blackwood Village, organized a lace-making cooperative for local women to have a source of income. She modernized the tenant cottages, introduced more efficient farming practices, and earned a reputation as a countess who was not just benevolent, but genuinely capable. In March 1839, Philippa was born, a calm, observant baby with auburn hair that made Sebastian catch his breath, so like Vivienne. But this time, the resemblance didn't bring pain, only a gentle tenderness. Vivienne somehow lived on in their daughter, and that was beautiful. She would have loved to know them, Sebastian said one night, holding Philippa while Benedict played at his feet. "Both you and the children." "I know," Rosalind replied, "and I hope that wherever she is, she sees and is happy." In 1843, Genevieve arrived, the youngest, lively and curious, who early on discovered a gift for questioning everything. Why were roses red? Why did butterflies fly? Why did Papa have grey hair if he wasn't that old? The house hummed with childish energy. Rooms that had spent years in darkness now hosted games, lessons, endless exploration. The gardens became magical kingdoms where Benedict hunted imaginary dragons, Philippa collected flowers to press meticulously, and Genevieve chased insects with alarming scientific fascination. Sebastian and Rosalind established traditions: an annual charity ball in December, a spring fair for the tenants, bi-weekly dinners where they invited not just nobles but local doctors, teachers, even successful merchants, scandalizing purists but enriching conversations. "You have democratized my home," Sebastian observed once, half joking. "I have enriched your home," Rosalind corrected. "Interesting people come from all walks of life." He couldn't argue. The years bled together in a colorful tapestry of family life. Benedict went to Eton, transforming from a boy into a young gentleman. Philippa revealed an exceptional musical talent, her fingers dancing on the piano keys with a grace that echoed Vivienne. Genevieve, to the delicious scandal of society, declared an interest in botany and began cataloguing the flora of Yorkshire with academic seriousness. The Dowager Countess, now in her 80s but still formidable, watched it all with poorly disguised satisfaction. "You transformed my son," she told Rosalind during a visit in 1850. "You gave him life again." "He allowed himself to be transformed," Rosalind replied diplomatically. "Don't be modest." The Countess squeezed her hand. "That 8-year-old girl saw something we adults had missed. She saw potential where others saw ruins. For that, and for so much more, you have my eternal gratitude." In 1851, when Rosalind was 36 and Sebastian 56, the Dowager Countess organized a grand ball to celebrate their 15th wedding anniversary. 250 guests filled Ravenscroft Manor. Rosalind wore an emerald green gown, the same color she had worn on the day of their reunion, now cut in a more modern style but equally elegant. Sebastian, his hair now almost completely silver, was more handsome than ever, his age lending him a dignity that youth did not possess. The children were radiant: Benedict at 14, tall and serious; Philippa at 12, shy but graceful; Genevieve at 8, her curious eyes taking everything in. During the waltz, Sebastian pulled Rosalind close. "Happy?" he asked, an echo of the question asked on their wedding night. "More than I dreamed possible." "Any regrets?" She looked at him, genuinely surprised. "Not one. You." "Only that I didn't believe that girl in the garden sooner." Rosalind laughed, a rich, joyful sound. "Then you would have waited another 13 years for me to grow up." "I think the timing was perfect." Perhaps it was. Later that night, when the guests had left and the house grew calm, Rosalind wandered into the library. There, hidden behind volumes of philosophy that no one else read, she found a small portrait. Vivienne, young and lovely, captured at the height of her beauty, smiling softly at the artist. Rosalind traced the face with a gentle finger. "Thank you," she whispered, "for loving him first, for teaching him that a heart can be big enough for two loves." Talking to ghosts. Sebastian was in the doorway, smiling softly. "Making peace with the past," she corrected. He approached, looked at the portrait. "She was part of who I was," he said, "but you are part of who I have become. Both essential, both loved. Is that not a betrayal?" "No," he pulled her close. "It's honesty. A heart is not a vessel with limited capacity, Rosalind. It expands, it grows. It accommodates what it receives without diminishing what it already holds." That night, they made love with the familiarity of 15 years, but a passion that had never waned. They knew every inch of each other, every preference, every way to give pleasure. When they finished, exhausted and satisfied, Rosalind rested her head on Sebastian's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she murmured. "And I love you, I always will." They were words he said easily now, frequently, as if making up for years of silence. They fell asleep intertwined, while in adjoining rooms, 3 miracles, Benedict, Philippa, and Genevieve, also slept. An impossible promise had become a real family, and a love that began in a rose garden now bloomed in a much vaster garden, an entire life built on the daily choice to honor that promise, day after day, year after year, forever. The later, Years wove themselves into a mosaic of quiet joys and challenges faced together. Benedict grew into a man of principle, studied law and estate management at Cambridge, fell in love with an earl's daughter, and married at 24. His wife, kind and intelligent, soon announced a pregnancy that would fill Ravenscroft with a new generation. Philippa, with her inherited musical talent, made a social debut that charmed London. Multiple suitors courted her, but she chose a musical baronet who saw her not as an ornament, but as an artistic partner. They married in an intimate ceremony, and soon twins arrived who filled visits with laughter. Genevieve surprised everyone, but not Rosalind, by refusing marriage proposals and enrolling in a botany course at a Scottish university that accepted women. She scandalized society, but became a respected author of a treatise on the native flora of Yorkshire, illustrated with her own watercolors of scientific precision and artistic beauty. Sebastian and Rosalind aged together. At 53, Rosalind was still beautiful, her golden hair now threaded with silver, her blue eyes only slightly marked by laugh lines. Sebastian, at 68, had completely white hair, his back less straight, but his eyes still penetrating and his mind sharp. They walked through the rose gardens every afternoon the weather permitted. The same roses that had witnessed a child's impossible promise still bloomed, descendants of the originals, meticulously cared for by a gardener who knew the story and kept the tradition sacred. It was on a particularly golden autumn afternoon in 1875, the leaves turning amber and crimson, that they sat on the stone bench where it all began. Rosalind, at 60, rested her head on Sebastian's shoulder. He, at 83, laced his fingers with hers, hands marked by time but still firm in their mutual touch. "You know," he said softly, "I still wake up sometimes thinking it was all a dream. The 8-year-old girl, the absurd promise, you returning, all a product of delirious loneliness. And then I see you, real, tangible, still here after. Nearly 4 decades," he kissed her hair. "A daily miracle." "It wasn't a miracle," Rosalind said. "It was a choice. My choice to come. Your choice to risk again. Our choice to honor our vows every single day. Was it worth it?" She lifted her head, met his gaze with those eyes that had first captured him so many years ago. "Every second, every challenge, every tear and laugh. I wouldn't change a thing. Not even the 13 years of waiting. Especially not those," she smiled. "They were part of the process. An 8-year-old girl wasn't ready. A 21-year-old woman was. The timing was perfect." Sebastian pulled her close. Around them, the roses swayed in the gentle breeze, releasing a perfume that was liquid memory. "I have something for you," Rosalind said suddenly, remembering. Her eyes sparkled with that mischievous glint that age had never completely erased. "Now?" Sebastian arched an eyebrow. "Now." She stood with a grace that defied her years. "Wait here." He watched her walk back to the manor, her back still straight despite the decades, her grey silk skirts whispering over the gravel. How many times had he watched her do just that? Thousands. And still her departure, even temporary, created a small void. Rosalind returned carrying a familiar object, the cherrywood box, the same one she had revealed during the confrontation with Grenville so many years ago. "This?" Sebastian frowned, confused. "I thought I never showed you all of them," she interrupted, sitting and placing the box between them. "I only read excerpts that horrible night. But there are 13 years of thoughts in here. 13 years of a young girl growing up, dreaming, preparing." She opened the box. Inside, dozens of letters tied in a faded blue ribbon. The paper of the oldest was yellowed, the ink nearly vanished. The most recent, written before her journey to Yorkshire in 1836, still held their sharpness. "I want you to read them," she said softly. "All of them. So you understand exactly how much time, how much heart, how much of me was dedicated to honoring that impossible promise." Sebastian took the first letter with hands that trembled slightly. The handwriting was childish, the letters large and uneven. "My dearest Lord Ravenscroft, I am 9 years old now. Miss Weatherby has begun my lessons. I am learning French, but it is hard. I think of your gardens often. Have the roses bloomed this year? Papa says children's promises don't count, but I know they do. I know because my heart knows. With respect, Rosalind Ashford." He moved to the next, and the next. Each letter was a window into the mind of a young girl growing up, her hopes, fears, lessons, doubts. He watched her mature through her words. The handwriting became elegant, the thoughts deeper, but the common thread remained, the promise. There was a letter written at 14 after her first ball, describing boring suitors and how none compared to the man in the garden. Another at 17, when she began collecting newspaper clippings about him, trying to build a picture of who he had become. And then, the letter written when she learned about Vivian and the baby. My dearest Lord Ravenscroft, my heart bleeds for your loss. Words are insufficient to express the depth of my sorrow upon learning of Lady Vivian's fate and that of your daughter. I do not truly know you, and yet I weep for you. I know some might say that now there is an opportunity, that your wife's death opens a path for an old promise, but that would be grotesque, vile. I do not come as a vulture feasting on tragedy. If we ever meet again, it will be because you are ready, because you choose life again, not because circumstance forced your hand. I will wait, even if it is forever. With deep compassion, Rosalind. Tears streamed silently down Sebastian's face. He didn't wipe them away. You waited 5 years, he murmured. 5 years between Vivian's death and your coming to me. I had to be sure, Rosalind said. Sure that it wasn't opportunism, that I had substance of my own to offer, not just a convenient presence. Sebastian dropped the letters, pulling her firmly against him. How was I ever worthy of you? He whispered against her hair. How did an 8-year-old child see something that deserved decades of devotion? Because you knelt, she said simply. That day in the garden when you could have laughed or dismissed me, you knelt. You spoke to me as an equal, though I was a child. You treated my promise with a seriousness it didn't deserve, but which taught me that promises matter. She held his face. You saw me, truly saw me. And that was enough to build a life on. They kissed, slow and gentle. It was not the fiery passion of youth, but something deeper, the intimacy of two souls who had walked together for so long that the borders between them had blurred. When they parted, the sun was setting, painting everything in hues of gold and rose. The grandchildren are coming tomorrow, Rosalind remembered. All 7 of them. The house will be chaotic. Welcome chaos, Sebastian said, smiling. Far better than dead silence. They rose, hands linked, and walked back to the manor. The windows were lit, golden light spilling onto the gardens. Inside, servants prepared dinner. Mrs. Thornhill, now very old but still the housekeeper, supervised with a watchful eye. Blackwell, retired but a frequent visitor, chatted with the younger butler who had taken over his duties. Ravenscroft Manor lived. It breathed. It thrived. The following week, during a visit from the entire extended family, Rosalind anonymously published her treatise on rural estate management, decades of work, condensed into a respectable volume that would begin circulating among progressive nobles, influencing practices throughout England. Sebastian found out, of course. He would recognize her ideas anywhere. Why anonymously? He asked. You should take credit. The work speaks for itself, she replied. I don't need my name on it to know that it is mine. He loved her more every day. How was that possible after so many years? And yet it was. The final years came gently. Sebastian passed away at 88 in his sleep, with Rosalind by his side holding his hand. His last words were, "The girl from the garden. My girl." Thank you. Rosalind lived another 6 years, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. Genevieve, who had never married but found her purpose in science, cared for her with devotion. On the morning she passed at 71, Rosalind was sitting in the rose gardens exactly where it all began. Benedict, now the Earl of Blackwood himself, found her there, smiling softly as if seeing someone she had long awaited. They buried her beside Sebastian. The graves of Vivian and the baby lay nearby under the same trees, an extended family even in death. On Rosalind's headstone, at her children's insistence, they engraved simply, "She honored her promise." And below, in smaller letters, "And taught us that true love is not found, it is chosen." Every day, the rose gardens at Ravenscroft Manor still bloom, descendants of the same plants that witnessed the impossible promise of an 8-year-old child. Tourists occasionally visit, drawn by the story, the countess who promised to marry at 8 and fulfilled it. But the true story is not about a promise. It is about choice. Rosalind's choice to prepare, to wait, to come when she was ready. Sebastian's choice to risk loving again, despite the terror. The choice of them both, day after day, year after year, to honor not just spoken vows, but the deeper commitment to build a life together. Promises are easy to make. Honoring them, truly honoring them, requires everything we are. Rosalind and Sebastian gave everything, and in return, they received everything. A complete life, a deep love, a family that continues through generations, and gardens that spring after spring remind us some promises, however impossible they may seem, are seeds, cared for with patience, watered with commitment, nurtured with daily choice. They bloom into gardens that last forever.